come from the occupied territory known as the state of Michigan. I'm one of the lucky ones that doesn't live near the Kalamazoo spill zone. I live about 2 hours from that area. I've grown up pretty privileged. I've been able to get an education. I grew up in a white middle-class community where I have easy access to a lot of opportunities that were a result of who I was. I can drink the tap water in my town. I can breathe the air without wheezing. I don't have to work in a mine to feed myself. I have food to eat. I have a roof over my head. I'm connected with movements. I don't feel alone. But I also know I'm one of the very few. And something about that has never felt right to me. Something about following the path laid out for people like me has never felt honest or right. So I enter those spaces wanting to agitate them. So I call my talk Mine is Yours, Collective Struggle, Heartbreak, and Strength, because I believe that we are all in this together. And a lot of what we experience is struggle and heartbreak when we're fighting these things. But whether it be personal or collective, it's all about survival. And when I'm in rooms like this with people who know what's going on and care, I do feel that strength that's not easily broken by the state. So for me, since this theme of the day is kind of animals in a sense, for me it all started with animals. I always felt safe around animals. I always liked animals. And the first things I learned about as a child were issues with animal abuse and animal testing and farming. And there's something in a child's mind that is so obviously wrong with that. Like when you see the pain in the eyes of animals and when you hear the screeches and the wails and the shrieks, it's just obviously wrong. And so it kind of started there for me. And then fast forward to 2010, Kalamazoo oil spill. That's where the pipe 6B broke initially. And when this happened, I was entering college. And the spill happened at the end of July, and in September, one of the top Enbridge reps came to my university, which was 2 hours away from this area. And he talked about how great the cleanup was, how the animals were being rehabilitated, how everything was just picture perfect. Didn't even mention tar sands. And this is 2 months after the spill. Now, at the time, I was somewhat naive, and I hadn't yet developed an analysis of corporate entities and influence. And so I sort of believed him, but something did seem kind of wrong about that. Like this happened 2 months ago, and everything's fine. So I dug a little bit deeper, and I started talking with people from the area and some of my friends who knew a little bit more. And I realized that everything he was saying was obviously manipulation. Everywhere I turned, I could see that. And once I knew that, it was just so obvious. And so during this time, Enbridge, being the monster they are, they called part of their cleanup maintenance and rehabilitation. And they expanded a section over the US-Canadian border at that time from 30 inches to 36 inches of line 6B. And they called that a part of their cleanup efforts, but obviously that's not even close to where the spill was. So they just sneakily did that to avoid the federal permitting process. And so 4 years later, it's 4 years from the Kalamazoo spill this year, they're expanding this line, and the expansion is almost complete. The spill is still not cleaned up, and I'll show some pictures from the spill, and Enbridge is still painting this completely false reality of what's going on in Kalamazoo. So these are some photos that one of my friends who was on the ground, lived right near where the spill happened, that she took of what went on in Kalamazoo in 2010. So here you can see the water in the river. And here's the boom that they used to clean up oil, but obviously tar sand sinks to the ground, so it's not as simple as that. You can see all the oil on the roots of the tree there. There's a closer up picture of that. And here you can see a bird covered in oil in the water. A goose. A little animal there covered in oil. Here's a closer up photo of that. You can just see all the nasty oil there. Here you can see some turtles. And the turtles trying to escape the water, and they're black, covered in oil. Some more birds. This is probably the saddest picture. It's a little unclear, but just a turtle struggling to even move, covered in oil. And so, my friend who lives in this area, the street of people that she lived on, all those people 4 years later are either sick, including her husband, or they have died. And sick meaning cancer, seizures, rashes, all those kinds of things. And the stories of the residents are told very little, but the stories of the animals are told less. And this is a picture of how Enbridge tried to cover up all that happened in the spill. From literally covering up oil with mud and sand to cleaning up. These are bags, so the clear bags are just debris and parts of the boom, but the black bags are dead animals. And they didn't want people to see that. Also, there were a lot of these kinds of trucks that would go around after the spill, and a lot of them were filled with dead animals. But of course, they didn't want us to see that. So, one of my textbooks in college was Environmental Studies 101 type of thing. And at the beginning of each chapter, it would talk about some other timely anecdote. And I remember one chapter specifically on wolves. And the title of this little anecdote was, "Why should we care about wolves?" And that always really annoyed me, that title, because that shouldn't even be a question that's asked. We should care about wolves because we should. Like, it just, to me, it's not a question. And so when I look at this spill and what happened to the animals, it just really makes me angry and sick, especially how it was just covered up like this. So my friend who I mentioned, who was there when all this happened, she said that the second night after the spill, keeping in mind that the spill didn't get shut off for 17 hours, because Enbridge didn't know what was happening. She said they started hearing gunshots, bam, 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 at night. And they later found out that Enbridge had hired some hunters just to go and kill some of the animals, to get rid of them so people didn't see what was happening. They also forbid the local experts, the local people who knew how to rehabilitate animals, from doing what they knew how to do. The locals had set up a center for animal rehabilitation, and Enbridge shut it down and told them if they said anything about it, that Enbridge would have their license revoked or something like that. There was a man who was very knowledgeable about reptiles, and he was writing a book at the same time as all this happened about how to help reptiles in disasters like this. And he was going to kind of head up the whole reptile portion of the spill, clean up and rehabilitation, and he was very vocal. And one day he just kind of disappeared. Like, just he was shut up. No one really heard from him about that. And he's still alive, but he's just completely silent. And there were some turtles, like I showed the pictures of, that were taken and held through the winter and rehabilitated in Enbridge's little rehabilitation center. And they were released the next spring. And they were released upstream of where the spill happened. And of course, when animals get released, they usually go home. So they did. And then they were recaptured. They were tagged and recaptured because they went right back to where all the oil was. And so then they were released again. And keeping in mind that they were released near 2 apartment buildings that were forcefully evacuated to get people out so that they wouldn't talk about what happened. A lot of those people became houseless. 250 families. But my friend, she's very savvy and smart. She was there when these turtles were released the second time. And the next day she came back and she couldn't find a single one. The next day, she did find a few, But the ones she saw, their shells, she said looked horrendous. Their flippers were withered, they were deformed, and they just looked awful. So, yeah. So, of course, then I asked myself, why should we care? Well, although that's obvious to me, it's, I guess, not obvious to everyone in Michigan and around the world. And so, in the beginning of 2013, 3 years after the spill and in the midst of this expansion of Line 6B, there was a group of us that kind of came together throughout the whole state and didn't need to ask those questions. Why should we care? Because we already did. And we were a very diverse group. Some of us were students, some of us came from the spill area, some came from land that the pipeline was being expanded through. Some came from Detroit, where the Marathon refinery is, where all this tar sands oil is being refined. Michigan, and we formed a group called the MyCats, or the Michigan Coalition Against Tar Sands, and this is our cat logo. You saw it at the beginning. And we did some actions last summer. So we did some lockdowns to stop construction. We had some tree sits. We had a 2-time tree sitter who did 2 consecutive tree sits. This is probably our most infamous action. Chris, he's a resident of Kalamazoo, experienced all this spill stuff. He rode a skateboard into a pipe and stopped construction on the pipeline for a day.
So
After the fact, he says he probably should have gone in there with a little more precautions, but he's okay. And his charges have been dropped twice, although the prosecuting attorney, in cahoots with Enbridge, keeps bringing them back up for reassessment. Here's another picture of one of the lockdowns, as well as that. And those 4 people were all charged with felonies and spent some time in jail for that. Fortunately, they got sentenced to probation instead of the 2 years that they were facing. But they did spend about a little over a month in jail. And then just recently, on the anniversary of the Kalamazoo oil spill, we went to the staging grounds near their last 50 miles of the 6B expansion, and we took this banner and we walked back and forth as they were across their little access driveway as they were coming back for the end of the day. And so we stopped. We caused a lot of annoyance to them and just kind of made a point. It was kind of a prelude of what's to come. We're having an action camp in 2 weeks. But the police were acting as glorified crossing guards, letting us know when we could cross the driveway. And we were doing this for about 3 hours and made a lot of people think a little bit more. A couple of friends were arrested, but their charges are sort of minimal. And also, interestingly enough, that friend, who was a very outspoken person, the one that I keep mentioning from Kalamazoo, she was standing near the road with a sign, and she got a metal ruler thrown at her. And she's a very well-known, outspoken activist from that area, so it's interesting that she was targeted in that way. Also in Michigan, there's the Line 6B, which is very infamous, and then there's the Line 5 that goes through the Upper Peninsula and down and out through the same way that 6B through Sarnia. And it goes through the Straits of Mackinac, which is the only point that all the Great Lakes intersect. And a spill there would be catastrophic.
do you know what Mackinac is? You know what that means?
What Mackinac means?
Yeah. Turtle.
Turtle. Well, that's interesting. Yeah, so a spill there would, Great Lakes are 20% of the world's fresh water. And that line is older than Line 6B. And people have dove down and taking images of where that pipeline crosses, and the supports are all decayed. The pipeline has not been updated, and they're pumping tar sands through it, which was not a pipe not intended to carry tar sands. That's a very, very scary one. So what do we do now? With all this, and this is one of Enbridge's maps, and I like it because it's just very clear on what their whole system is in the Midwest and up into Canada. But it's often really daunting, and yesterday on the way out here I got to stop by the Dan Line 9 blockade, and that was so encouraging. It's like you meet people in the same, that are doing the same thing that you didn't even know. It's just really awesome. But it's often really lonely doing this type of work, and it feels often kind of hopeless, especially when this expansion's almost done. So part of what I'm here to do is learn from all of you, and I definitely learned some at the Line 9 blockade yesterday. And I'm happy to answer questions. This is our information. We have a website, our email, our Facebook page, and our Twitter. We're all connected. But I'm happy to answer questions about anything if folks have them. All right. Thanks, everyone.